And generally, this journey is a response to people who said that they wanted to hear a bit more about what the halacha, what the Jewish tradition actually says, and B, in the context of the civil legal process which now exists, by which synagogues or synagogue movements, and I'll talk about some of the complexity of that maybe if it's relevant at a later point, can do a ceremony and have that ceremony registered civilly as a marriage under the Same-Sex Marriages Act of what's now, I think, 2013, a couple of years ago already. So that's sort of roughly the journey. Thoughts, questions, observations? No? Let's go back to it. So, I mean, I'm sure I don't need to say this, but, you know, because this is, you know, like, let me just sort of do my advanced apology. I'm going to have to do this as kind of straight halacha. I'm going to have to kind of talk about this as if we're having a conversation about, you know, dropping bits of parmesan in the bolognese sauce. I'm aware that for some people it's intensely personal and very, very close, and I will be trying to be as respectful of that as I can, and I'm sure we'll all be, you know, as respectful as that as we can. So, you have to start here. In Vayikra, in Leviticus chapter 18, you get this verse. With a man you shall not lie, as with the lyings of a woman. It's a toiva, it's an abomination. And then there's another verse which happens slightly later. In the context of other things that are called toivot, we have incestual relationships. We also have things like not keeping kosher. There's a sort of a very, very large range of things that the rabbis kind of clearly don't like, but they label as tova, and exactly what tova does and doesn't mean, I'm not really going to get into.
If it was that strong, wouldn't it be sheketz?
I mean, sheketz is. I wonder if what you're saying is, wouldn't it be that they get killed, right? Is that what you meant to say?
Well, it would be a stronger.
Taiva is pretty strong. I mean, sheketz is a slightly different issue altogether. I mean, I'm never particularly sure what to do with that kind of labelling anyway. We'll see what it means and where it goes and with what level to take it. That will definitely matter. Murder is neither. Murder is neither. I mean, you know, it's very, very loaded and very, very complicated, and it kind of, a lot of it seems to depend on what you think about male-to-male anal intercourse. If you think that it is, but most of the toivot have something to do with something cultic. It seems it's not absolute. It's not obvious. I'm not going to spend much time digging around toivot as an issue. I'm gonna. You'll see where I'm going. And one thing that gets said about traditional rabbinics and same-sex intimacy in general is that the generations of the formation of rabbinic Judaism didn't know sort of loving, compassionate, mutual same-sex engagement, right? You know, so that when they are opposed to homosexuality, they're opposed to maybe something cultic. There's definitely something that seems to happen about some sort of idolatrous use of small boys by older men that the rabbis clearly have a huge problem with, which I'm not really interested in, you know, addressing really at all. But you can find in the rabbinic tradition in various places sort of odd whispers of something that might be related to this. You know, there's one rabbi who doesn't want to get married, and they ask him, why aren't you getting married? He says, oh, I'm an istinist. An istinist is someone who just sort of doesn't want to sort of, it's all a bit much. You know, and there are some straight people who feel that, but there are also, I think, a lot of, particularly in history, gay people who also would have responded in that kind of way. There's that, you know, I know that some people read a story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan as being about a same-sex attraction. I don't read that story that way, but there are some kind of little moments where you can start to see that. And I just thought I would bring one here just so that we can kind of just sort of see what may or may not have been going on back in the time of the formation of the rabbinic mindset, as it were. So the next piece is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, so maybe 300, 400. I'm afraid I can't date Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi exactly, but Rabbi Yehuda ben Pazi goes up to the attic of the academy, and he sees two men niskekin with each other. It has to mean having intercourse with each other. So he's kind of, he stumbled on a couple of yeshiva bochers having sex up, in the loft. And they said to him, Rabbi, note that you are one and we are two. Right? We're going to outnumber you. Shtum. Right? Keep shtum. I mean, I don't really know what you sort of do about that. But, it's clear that these kinds of intimacies are very, very old, and we have, of course, in other societies, ancient examples of same-sex attraction. And it's not surprising to see that within rabbinic Judaism. But it's kind of, I think, worthy of remark to see something like that just sort of cropping up high. So, here we go. Let's go back to that first verse, which is an odd formulation. Don't lie with a man as with the lyings, mishkavei isha. And so if you know any grammar at all, right, B'nai Yisrael, you can hear B'nai is plural, what's the grammar of that? When it's genitive, thank you, plural genitive. We have some proper linguistic experts here, but that's good. Right, it's genitive plural, so it's with the lyings of a woman. So Ibn Ezra here says lyings, mishkavei, this is in the plural, it's not appropriate to explain further. So it's really difficult to work out exactly what this stuff means because there's a sort of a slight reticence to talk about it. You have to sort of really keep juggling around. And the clearest thing that I've got is actually a 20th century text. I think Abraham Steinberg Schlitter is still with us, the author of one of these sort of extraordinary compendia, the Encyclopedia HaTalmudit. And he's written this. Regarding liability for stoning for homosexual relations, that's, by the way, the punishment that the rabbinic system deems worthy for this. The Torah says, Mishkavei Isha, and the Gemara in Sanhedrin says, Scripture teaches that there are two ways of lying with a woman. That is, there are two and no more. There is Kedarka and Shelo Kedarka. Kedarka, literally, in her derech, in her way, in her path, as it were, and Shelo Kedarka, and not in her way. And it's clear that Shelo Kedarka means anal. And he quotes various sources. And all other sexual relations are called derech ibarim. So what have we got? We've got that you can't lie with a man as with the lyings of a woman. Well, that now has to mean Shelo Kedarka, right? Because you can't lie with a man as you would lie with a woman kedarka. It has to be the other thing. So what we're isolating is what I would call the sort of pshat, but also the sort of the rabbinically realized pshat, the straightforward meaning of this key verse. It's not a blanket ban on homosexuality, same-sex attraction. Doesn't mention same-sex female attraction at all. And this verse doesn't mention what Abraham Steinberg is referring to, or what the rabbinic world refers to as derech ibarim. Derech ibarim, literally, way of limbs. Let me be as explicit as it's possible to be. We're all grown-ups. The penis is judged to be a limb, right? So, things that you could do with a penis which don't involve Shelo Kedarka, for want of a better term, penetration. Now, that's not to say that if the biblical verse only prohibits anal penetrative intercourse between men, anything else is okay. That's not how sort of rabbinic Judaism works. But that's to isolate the straightforward meaning of that verse from everything else. And you'll see why I think that's worth kind of pointing out later. My next source is from the Shulchan Aruch, which is, the great legal code, where it says that whoever copulates with one of the forbidden relations non-genically, derech ibarim. So when it says the forbidden relations, this is including that list of things that are called tovah, including sleeping with your mother, or revealing the nakedness of your mother, or all these kinds of things. If you have non-penetrative sexual relations with that person, right? That means derech ibarim, or hugged or kissed them, or enjoyed skin-to-skin contact, such a person is lashed and suspected of arayot, suspected of forbidden intercourse. So now we've got this kind of structure of the Shalok Darka, which is the verse in all its clarity, for which one is deemed to be liable to be stoned, and then derech ibarim contact, and in terms of and we'll see a little more about women, but let me just keep this between men and men at this moment. Derech ibarim, for which one is lashed, and the rabbis probably don't like it, but it's existing in a slightly different place. Pause. How we do it?
I thought that when we copulated, it means intercourse.
Well, this is talking about two kinds of possible sexual relationships, sexual acts that one can have. And let's stay between men and men at this moment. Yes. There is penetrative intercourse, which is the meaning of that verse.
I thought that was copulation. I thought that's what copulation meant.
Right, and there are then other forms of sexual activity. I don't know. I profess more understanding of the rabbinic system than I do of the etymology of the word copulate. I don't know. Penetration.
Something says whoever copulates, and then it says relations non-genus.
Yeah. So I can't remember what the Hebrew is. But what this is talking about is This is talking about non-penetrative sexual intimacy, physical sexual intimacy. That's what the Shulchan Aruch is talking about in this point. What he's saying, penetration is you are liable for stoning, and for anything else, including, by the way, the hugging, kissing, and the enjoyment of skin-to-skin contact. And I think that means like the sort of hug which gives one a frisson of sexual excitement. I don't think it's talking about giving your mum a kiss as you say see you tomorrow, my dear. It's not that. But if it is sexualized, right? Then then it is a problem.
So is there a paragraph about what is considered to be forbidden relations?
There's a whole list. There's a whole list. Actually, we read it in the afternoon of Yom Kippur, bizarrely, or maybe not bizarrely, depending on how we understand. But there's a whole series. There's a whole series, and this verse. I'm sorry, I can't remember whether or not it's the chapter 18 or the chapter 20, but is bang in the middle. I think it's chapter 18. Chapter 18 is in the middle. It's the end, towards the end of that list. And then it gets repeated again, more or less, a little bit later.
I can't remember. I remember that when we read it, I can't remember what's in it. Does it include people of the same sex? In this case.
This is the verse that talks about people of the same sex is this rather strange verse, with the man you shall not lie, as with the lyings of a woman.
It's not in the Shulchan Aruch, it's a list of the forbidden relations.
It's discussed. Homosexual intercourse is discussed as part of that sort of discussion. That's what's going on at the beginning of Evan Hazer at that point. So again, now just to go backwards in time a little bit from the Shulchan Aruch to the Rambam, but when the Rambam is talking about these derech ibarim, same-sex intimacies, non-penetrative man-to-man intimacies, he says such a person is loke min Torah, is lashed according to the Torah, for it says, "Do not engage in any of the abhorrent practices of the non-Jews." which is interesting, right? For the Rambam, these kinds of homosexual intimacies are markers of non-Jewish and idolatrous behaviour. So that's sort of reawakening this sort of question about, yeah, I mean, there clearly was cultic homosexual behaviour, which the rabbis find abhorrent, which I don't think anybody would be interested in defending at all. I mean, sorts of sort of public school, older teacher, younger boy, like those kinds of issues, where there's clearly a kind of a radical power issue at place, which regardless of the sex of either, the gender of either of the two people, is just, abhorrent, and rightly so today, which isn't really what we're faced with as a community, and in terms of the nature of what's going on. Well, right. This is, yeah, and I mean, and even I'm not even sure how much Rambam knew about what was going on in ancient Mesopotamia. So it's clearly existing in the imagination of the Rambam as something which they do. And when it says, "Do not come near to uncover nakedness," that says, "Don't even come close to the Shalok Adarka stuff," right? So this is the classic siyag la Torah, right? A fence around the Torah. That if the thing that they really don't want you to do is penetrative intercourse, they'll put a siyag la Torah. And actually, in the context of sexual relationships, a siyag is not a bad thing, right? I mean, I think that the more intimate sexual intimacy almost invariably happens as a result of less serious sexual intimacy. So, an idea of sort of protecting that is no bad thing, and certainly that exists right the way throughout the rabbinic tradition. Just worth thinking about menstrual purity, Torah Mishpacha. The thing that is considered actually a toivah also, which is intercourse, penetrative intercourse with a woman who is still deemed as tameh as a result of her period. They put a siyag around that, and certainly within Orthodox communities, you'd expect husband and wife to be in a separate bed, or a mattress that can be sort of unzipped, or that they put a little thing up in the middle of the mattress, and people won't even touch they won't even pass a baby from one to the other, put the baby down, the other person picks it up. And I think that obviously, you can take some of these things maybe too far, but the idea of a siyag to protect a core is not necessarily a crazy idea, certainly when it comes to matters of sexual behaviour. Okay. So far I've said nothing about female-to-female intimacy, and there's nothing about female-to-female intimacy in the Torah, in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. You can find a discussion of it in the Gemara, and I've brought you the Locus Classicus, which is from Yevamot. Rav Huna says, women who rub against one another are forbidden from marrying Kohanim. So, Musolelet Zoim Zo, I think, is the Hebrew. And these women join a kind of a collection of other women who are perceived to be licentious. That's the problem. The Kohanim aren't allowed to marry women who have been licentious. Other people who fall into the category of licentious, people who go around wearing red. I mean, sorry, I'm now dealing rabbinically. Ella's absolutely right. Biblically, I mean, a divorced woman. I mean, you're right. A divorced woman isn't allowed to marry a Kohen. A convert isn't allowed to marry a Kohen, because all Kohanim are deemed steeped in depravity from the moment of their birth, according to a kind of an unoverridable rabbinic understanding. By the way, we do those weddings, and I've got a long paper on that if anybody's interested in that as an issue. But yeah, that's where it starts. And this is so, even according to Rabbi Elazar, who said, an unmarried man who comes upon an unmarried woman without the purpose of making her his wife makes her a fully licentious woman. This refers to a man. But when a woman comes upon another woman, this is general flirtatiousness. The Hebrew word pritzut da'alma. Other things which are considered pritzut da'alma, wearing red. Married women who don't cover their hair. Pritzut da'alma. So, rabbinically, the place of lesbian sexual activity, pritzut da'alma, is in a very different place to these two stages of male-to-male sexual intimacy, derech ibarim, which is loke, for which one is whipped, and shalok darka, for which one is chayav mita, for which one is liable for stoning.
What does it mean when you say man becomes
Sexual intercourse without the intention of becoming married to a woman. So if a woman, so God bless the United Synagogue and all who sail in her, because they should, a woman who's ever had sexual intercourse with a boyfriend and that relationship breaks up should not, according to Rabbi Elazar, be allowed to marry a Kohen, because she is, by dint of that former relationship, a zonah, which in contemporary Hebrew we would translate as I would use the word whore, right? I mean, I would use a kind of a really nasty pejorative word for that, and therefore should not be allowed to marry a Kohen. You know, this gives rise to all kinds of interesting conversations.
Is she allowed to marry the Kohen if the Kohen is her boyfriend within the United States?
Very, very good question. Very, very good question. I am aware of the United Synagogue refusing to marry a couple because the woman had been refused a get from her first husband for 25 years, during which time she civilly divorced the husband, civilly married the second husband, and lived together for 15 years as husband and wife with the second husband. But the United Synagogue deemed her to have been adulterous with the second husband, so refused to marry her when eventually the guy gave the get. Guess which? No. After he gave the get, yes. Guess which movement they are now members of. I mean, you know, so right. I mean, you know, so tricky. Bracket. I'm not really interested in bashing in the United Synagogue. There's some fabulous synagogue rabbis, but there's a big thing in the United Synagogue about not having the husband and wife live at the same address before they get married, which means that when you fill in the civil papers, there's a whole kind of thing about whether or not you admit that you're living together, or whether or not you have to kind of move into a different address to get the civil. Because, by the way, you can't lie on the civil paperwork. You lie on the civil paperwork. Gerald's very concerned. That's a criminal act. Never mind. Okay, moving on.
But if you've been living with somebody and your parents breaks up, do you have to get before you get married?
If you had intercourse with someone, I was looking at this just yesterday in preparation for next week's session. Here we go. Here's an answer to you. I'll deal with that next week. So I think, one of the interesting things about what we've just been talking about, I think, has been placing homosexual sexual intimacy in the context of other forms of intimacy which are discussed by halacha. You know, I remember being in America and I was very involved in this when I was in America, and somebody said, the rabbis just go on and on and on about homosexuality. This is surely a sign that they're repressing their own and they can't handle it. It's a homophobic thing. To which the answer is no. The rabbis go on and on and on about absolutely everything, and actually, the concerns around homosexual sexual intimacy fit into a kind of a broader system of things which, in the context of what we as a synagogue or what we as a Jewish community, celebrate, supports, don't support, permit, prohibits, feel embarrassed about. it would be wrong to place the sort of a rabbinic concern with homosexual intimacy entirely outside all of that. And one of the things that interests me very much in the context of particularly where we're going to end up is this idea. For a man to sleep with his married wife, if the wife has not waited a period of time following her period, after which she's gone to the mikveh, that's a tova. That's an abomination. So the sort of
according to Torah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, at the very most minimum, to sleep with a woman during her period is clearly. I mean, it lives in exactly that kind of place.
Does it get you stoned?
I forget exactly what death penalty it results in, but it's one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So I think the question is to, when I do premarital counselling, what do I do? What do I insist upon? What kinds of practice do I insist that couples who we do a chuppah for will follow? It's a good question. All right. Let's move. So what does that mean about rabbinic Judaism? Is rabbinic Judaism homophobic? Is it in the context of what most people would now feel about same-sex couples? Does that make Judaism immoral? Yes, if it is opposed to these kinds of questions. What I've brought you is part of the. So I slightly mentioned this before. The Committee on Jewish Law and Standards is the major halacha developing organisation of the Masorti movement in America. It's made up of 25 members, and they meet and they discuss papers and they pass papers. Sometimes they pass mutually exclusive papers. Sometimes they pass papers by a minority as opposed to a majority. It's got its own kind of constitution, and it's up to individual rabbis of individual synagogues to decide on what they do or don't want to accept. But it's the sort of clearinghouse from the Masorti halacha, and the CJLS has had a go at homosexuality as a halachic issue on two major occasions. Once in 1992 and once in 2006. The major paper in 1992 was Rabbi Joel Roth's paper, which we'll see in just a second. But what I'm just going to give you now is from Rabbi Roth's 2006 paper, because Rabbi Roth continued to believe in all the things that he believed in 1992 in 2006. So this is Joel Roth in 2006. Of the 25 people in the around the table, 13 voted in favour of his paper, 8 against, with 4 abstained. My question is, does this make Judaism homophobic? Is it immoral to be opposed to this kind of stuff, right? So this is Joel Roth. The fact that a decision causes pain does not mean that the decision is immoral. A moral law can have negative consequences on the lives of people. But we make the judgment that the reasonableness and the morality of the law outweigh the hurt done to the individual in such cases, and this is the case here. Very, very brave thing to say. Says the gay person to the rabbi, Rabbi, by saying that there is no possibility of sexual intimacy with another man, which is the only thing that I want, you impose upon me a life sentence of loneliness, and that is a terrible thing to say to a person. Says Rabbi Roth, I'm sorry, but I have to do that because that's what the halacha says. And if you are to accuse me of immorality, and I believe that God is moral, the only response that I have to you is that although you, Shmuley, are clearly suffering, that in itself is not proof of the immorality of this generalized approach. In theory, I think that has to be right. Whether or not I would apply that to someone who's gay, we'll get onto that. Let me give you another example, which I've heard Rabbi Roth express as he's talked about this. He talks about what happens if someone dies just between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, in a frum environment. And the whole apparatus of this family and these mourners deeply wants to sit a full shiva, but it's Sukkot the day after the funeral, and shiva's one day, or maybe even less than a day. Maybe there's like no real shiva at all. They sit for 10 minutes at the cemetery, and shiva is gone. And Shmini Atzeret finishes Shaloshim, and Shaloshim is gone. And the day after Simchat Torah, there is no mourning left for this family, and they are sort of kicked back into the real world. And they're sort of staggering slightly. It's really quite strange. I've been involved in that a couple of times. It can be really... Sorry? Right. It can be really very, 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 very odd. And there is a suffering that the person experiences, which in the context of the broader Jewish approach, which is that you have to samachta b'chagecha, somehow the command to be happy on the festival of Sukkot sort of dominates your individual need for an individual, maybe even a valid individual experience, that will get squashed. That is something which happens within Judaism, and in theory has to be right, whether or not we would agree with I don't know, the sort of the balancing act on the issue of homosexuality. So, is Judaism moral? Is Judaism homophobic?
What you said was that if you didn't have a sexual relationship, you were condemned to life of loneliness. I don't see the option.
Okay. Fine. We'll do that one in 3 weeks' time. In 2 weeks' time. We'll talk about it. I mean, that I think is a question that I don't know the answer to. Being in the fortunate position of being A, straight, and B, having found someone with whom I celebrate all my life together. So I feel like I'm pasul ba'idut. I feel I can't apply. I feel I can't be a valid witness on that aspect. I think it's a very good one.
A question you haven't. Here you're talking about the business of sexuality, homosexuality, but I think before we actually talk about the business of physical intimacy, a question we need to ask is whether is actually if there's any connection between that and love.
Right. It's very interesting. The Torah has very little to say about an emotional state. Actually, rabbinic Judaism in general has very little to say about emotional states. I mean, it's not particularly interested in them. I mean, but chesed is an action.
Yes, and that's why I wonder whether there is actually, because Torah says you mustn't do it. I mean, there is this 18:2 says you mustn't do it, and that to me is an expression of chesed. If you love someone of your own sex,
then don't do it.
Then don't do it because that's the loving expression.
Right. I mean, Right. Yes. Let's keep going.
Yeah.
And so, just again, Joel Roth, now writing in 1992. I'm sorry, there's a slight typo here. It's not that he suddenly got his smicha between 2006 and 1992. Then he got his smicha in 70 something or 71 or something. Anyhow, right? So Joel Roth is now talking again about this position of Shmuel, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he says this: we may be able to understand when one cannot fulfill the mandate the law imposes, but that does not lead us to the conclusion that the mandate was itself immoral. It's quite interesting. Right? I mean, if somebody says, I'm a kleptomaniac, it's deeply wired into my psyche. I hate making these analogies. I'm not making an analogy between this and same-sex intimacy, but if somebody says, I couldn't help it, I just couldn't help it, it doesn't mean that the command not to steal is therefore an immoral command, necessarily, right? We have asked whether a moral God could prohibit homosexual behaviour, even in the hardest of cases. Right, here he means, what's that scale called? Is it the McKinsey scale?
Mm.
Right, even when someone is, right at the very, very far edges of the McKinsey scale, and we have answered that God could and that God did. Joel Roth's halachic stance in general is that of a positivist. In other words, if the law states something, that's the law, right? What we're going on to see, which is this sort of Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner position, and another rabbi very much associated with this very different Jewish prudential approach, is called Tucker. They are non-positivists. In other words, they believe that there is something more important than the letter of the law for a law to be a good law.
But how does minhag get into it?
How does minhag get into it?
Yeah. I mean,
Subject for a different conversation. I mean, we're actually, we don't need, there's very little about this which is minhag. I mean, we're in halacha territory. I think. I mean, come back to me in 20 years' time, and there may well be minhagim that have arisen that are relevant to this conversation. But at the moment, is
Joel Roth.
a great question, right?
What
It's
does he have to do?
No. So Joel Roth is grew up in the conservative movement, studied the Jewish Theological Seminary. I don't think ever left the Jewish Theological Seminary, pursued his PhD at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and became a professor of Talmud at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he perceives himself as conservative. And he perceives that he hasn't changed anything that he's been saying for the last 40, 50 years. But he also perceives that the conservative movement seems to have sort of moved so that, and this is the example that he gave. Joel Roth wrote the original responsum on the admittance of women into the rabbinical school at JTS. So that, and at that time, he was treated incredibly badly by most of the Talmud faculty at JTS, who hated this responsum, hated it, and felt that he was a complete liberal washout. I used to be the liberal, and now, he says, I find myself being viewed as the reactionary. And I, he says, haven't changed. Everything's kind of changed around. He left the CJLS. I'm not sure if he's rejoined, but he resigned from the CJLS after this process because he felt he could no longer be part of a committee that accepted this Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner piece. And there are certainly many within the conservative movement who were pleased to see the back of him as a representative of conservative Judaism. Joel Roth, to this day, doesn't admit, refuses to let go. Right. Very interesting. Okay. I'm going to rest my tubes, I don't promise to not interrupt. In fact, I almost certainly will interrupt quite a lot. But can I have a volunteer to start taking us through this Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner piece? Thank you, Ruth.
People who will not tell that have no particular need for fiscal halachic responses.
Right. In other words, people who do whatever they want to do, they're going to do whatever they want to do.
Right.
If they're going to eat pork, they're going to eat pork. If they're going to drive on Shabbos, they're going to drive on Shabbos. So they'll do whatever they want to do. Right.
The people who are observant and are also gay or lesbian are caught in a terrible dilemma with no halachic guidance about the integration of their Jewish identity and their sexual orientation.
We did become, I was in America at the time, and the American language is absolutely perfect. Don't ask, don't tell, right? And that was what was going on in the American military, which is that you weren't allowed to be gay in the military, but don't ask, and nobody asked, and nobody told. And actually, it now seems that it was particularly, there were a lot of lesbian women who were kind of active in the American military service who, were just sort of getting on with being soldiers and sailors and part of the Air Force. And there was quite a bit of that was going on in synagogues. And maybe there's a bit of that goes on in our shul, which is, we kind of know who is, and that's fine. But we don't say, we don't say, oh, that's great. Well, the thing is, what we want to check is, are you doing this? And if you're not doing them, we can give you an aliyah, and we do it. We've just sort of, because we can't get into any of the kind of conversation at all, we've become sort of muted on the whole idea. And I think, and this is sort of a New London point, we kind of hope to be perceived as being generally welcoming, but slightly fearful of actually being asked to speak specifically because we are very worried about what might happen at that point. So he's kind of talking about, I think, really us.
Our core conviction is that dignity for gay and lesbian Jews, as for heterosexual Jews, results neither from blanket permission nor from blanket prohibition of all sexual activity, but rather from situating it within the matrix of Isur Heter. Isur
V'heter. So Isur prohibited, Heter permitted.
Permission and prohibition, which permeates all of Jewish life.
So pause there. So that this issue of Isur V'heter, it's a technical term. I mean, it's a hugely important piece of what halacha is all about. So what he's saying, and welcome to this word dignity, which we will see a great deal more regarding. And again, I just want to make the point that for heterosexual Jews, and even married heterosexual Jews, issues of Isur V'heter apply. There are things which are prohibited and things which are permitted some of the time, and actually even all of the time.
You don't go around asking questions.
Not quite sure that's the whole point. I mean, I think.
Every married man, you don't question, did you sleep with your wife? This kind of thing.
Right. I'm not sure. I acknowledge it is a question. Right. I acknowledge that is part of it. I just want to say I don't. And this is a Louis point, I think, frankly, that you can't just not ask questions. Actually, you know what? Louis was very good at not asking questions. Louis. Right, my favourite Louis story before Rabbi Jacobs, Zechron Bracha, moved into Carlton Vale was that he used to live the other side of St John's Wood High Street, and instead of walking home from shul that way, he would walk from home that way, so as not to have to walk down the high street and see Mrs. Cohen coming out of the hairdressers, because he didn't want to ask the questions. So actually, like everything in New London, right? It's both one thing and the other. But the other thing that Louis said is that you can't just leave all these sorts of complicated issues unengaged with, even if they're difficult to engage with. You have to engage with them, because what happens to a person who really wants to know what the issue is and thinks that Judaism might not be for them because he doesn't have a sophisticated enough response. So he also said that.
Yeah, it's consistent. You may engage in a discussion when someone raises the issue. You can't just deny there's an issue there and cause discussion. But when it's as delicate as that, you don't go out of your way to make inquiries to find out whether there's an issue that needs to be discussed.
No, fair, perfectly fair. Let's keep going.
Contemporary Jewish law is based upon the legal and moral text found in written and oral Torah. The written Torah famously pronounces that God created humanity in his image, that it is not good for man to live alone.
Pausing there. How many lawyers? Only one. Wow. Right? When Lord Denning wanted to do something and didn't have the positive elements of the legal tradition in order to do it, Gerald, what would he do? What would he quote? What would he cite? No, he'd quote Shakespeare.
Oh, yeah. He was looking for it.
Right.
His idea of what was fair, and he up the questions, he takes some decision that we referred to decades years ago, and twist it out of all context and fit it to his particulars.
Right. Now, if you are a positivist and you start to see somebody talking about God creating all humanity in God's image and it's not good for man to be alone, you put your head in your hands and you go wild, right? Because you kind of know what's coming. Now, on the one hand, I think all halacha is about this. All halacha involves, and actually this is what I'm talking about on Saturday, all halacha is about sort of an ethic which underlies everything, that makes everything right or not. Joel Roth would deny that. And Joel Roth says, no, it says this, and it therefore is this. So you've got this sort of battle that's going on between the positivists and, for want of a better term, the sort of those who are explicitly engaging with the moral underpinning of what it is that they're doing. And here is the fight over what it is to be conservative Mazurti. The answer is Joel Roth is very, very much an outlier on that spectrum. But so, you know, when you start to sort of hear people talk about dignity and the creation of all human beings in God's image, you know, as a positivist, you go, Rosemary.
But you must love your neighbour as yourself.
Oh, yeah, right. You know, what does that mean, right?
And that God is good to all, has mercy to apply to all creatures. Your old Torah, Talmud, Mishdrash and Codes, draws upon these and many other biblical passages to create a system of law that sanctifies the daily life. Those who serve God in truth.
Okay, let's keep it.
While some readers might conclude from text reviewed above that Jewish law imposes a universal and undifferentiated ban on homosexual intimacy, we must emphasise the nuances found in this literature.
What he's talking about there is you've got the biblical verse, you've got Shalok Darka, you've got Derech Ibarim, you've got this sort of thing in Yevamot about these women, and you know there are different things that are going on. Yeah.
The dominant voice of rabbinic interpretation follows Maimonides regarding lesbian intimacy and male homosexual act, other than anal sex as assumed halacha banned by the Bible, albeit indirectly.
Let me pause there. There are two kinds of halacha. There is D'oraita halacha and D'Rabbanan halacha. Now, a D'oraita halacha, literally from the Orah, from the Torah, and D'Rabbanan, which means the rabbis made it up. So, for example, the obligation to light Shabbat candles is D'Rabbanan. And the obligation not to see the kid in its mother's milk is D'oraita. Now, it gets complicated, because although sometimes Maimonides is very, very strict about what counts as D'oraita, sometimes the rabbinic world is spectacularly lax in its use of one phrase rather than the other phrase. And that you will very, very often hear arguments about whether or not something is D'oraita or D'Rabbanan, and it's not always the case that there's a clear biblical verse. So let's just go back to this this first page, and where 1, 2, 3 up from the bottom, the Rambam in Israel, so Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Israel Bia. When the Rambam is talking about Derech Ibarim and female to female sexual intimacy, the Rambam thinks that this is prohibited on the basis of the biblical verse. Do not engage in the abhorrent practices of the non-Jews. That's what leads the Rambam to say that all those things are d'oraita prohibited. Okay, so we now know what the Rambam was thinking of when the Rambam said that any form of same-sex sexual intimacy, man to man, woman to woman, you know, even if it's not penetrative, it's all d'oraita. Nonetheless, and I haven't brought you Nachmanides because it just got quite technical and we had quite enough of all of that. Nachmanides, the Ramban, disagrees with Maimonides, and suggests that although Shalok Darka, penetrative male-to-male intercourse, is d'oraita, the other stuff is the Rabbanan. This is very, very technical and would be completely irrelevant but for what we're going to see later. Okay? Yeah. So what we're having is a bit of an argument as to whether or not it's all d'oraita prohibited, or only one element is d'oraita prohibited and the rest is d'Rabbanan prohibited. I haven't concluded a thought, Joel, if that's all right. Let's keep going.
That Maimonides is convinced in his this ruling is a asalata, a later rabbinic interpretation for the Bible itself, never mentioned or prohibits any of these acts.
Okay. Right.
I'm struggling with this comment that one of these regarded as always the writer, other than anal sex.
No, sorry. Everybody agrees that anal sex is d'oraita. The question is, what do you do about everything else? So derech ibarim, male-to-male contact, and all female contact.
The dominant was a rabbinic interpretation. Follows Maimonides.
Regarding lesbian intimacy and male homosexual intimacy other than anal sex, as an isur d'oraita. Close brackets. Everybody agrees that male-to-male penetrative anal intercourse is definitely d'oraita. That nobody disagrees with that. I mean, it can. I mean, that's clear. The question is, what's the rest of it? Okay. So, continuing with this Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner, Shiva. Would somebody else like to read? Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you.
The halachic space is deeply degrading to gay and lesbian Jews. Quite apart from social and literary traits that have taught contempt for homosexuals, legal norms that argue more than more clean around the absolute suppression of their libido, creating an environment of humiliation.
Can we just pause there? I know, Elizabeth, you disagree with this, right? Legal norms that demand the absolute suppression of their libido create an environment of humiliation. Now, not everybody thinks that. Some gay people are prepared to accept that they are not humiliated and that the correct thing for them to do in order to live well before their God is to absolutely suppress their libido. I absolutely acknowledge there are some people who feel that way. There are also a lot of people who feel the other way, who feel the absolute command to suppress all libido is something which is too hard to impose upon a human being.
I just don't get the connection between sex and love. I mean, we've had this case today where those 4 men and 2 women, I think it is, were convicted of grooming girls and locking. They wanted sex. Where's the love? There wasn't it.
Well, I think it's certainly possible to pursue sex without love. I mean, I think that's, and we may well be living in a society where that becomes much more, and I don't like that. I don't support that. And I'm not interested in that. There was this sort of recent thing about these letters of the Pope. Did anyone catch that story? Where it does indeed seem that the Pope was in love without any question of there being physical intimacy. And it may well be that there are people who were capable of pulling that off. I'm not even, but I'm not.
And many people,
Right.
I guess this really is what I acknowledge the validity of the question that you're raising. Exactly how I think that plays out in the lived experience of people who, the people who are observant and also gay or lesbian are caught in a terrible dilemma. Like those people, I think is much more complicated.
I mean, we're not all.
And it's not really relevant.
The fact that some people may be perfectly capable of deep love while suppressing any sexual instinct that flows from it doesn't speak to the vast majority who don't.
I mean, monasticism, for example, is an institution devoted to that.
Right,
Expression
right,
of
right.
a kind of spiritual love without any kind of
Right.
contact.
I mean,
we are not all capable of being monastic.
I think that's right, and I think there's a theology behind that. I mean, there's a reason why that is much more associated with Catholicism and Christianity in general than it is with Judaism, and why Judaism celebrates the mitzvah of physical intimacy within a sanctified relationship. I mean, I don't want to conclude that. I'll just sort of leave that sort of hanging. Yeah, sorry, Ellen, thank you.
At this point, it is impossible to responsible prosecuting who I understand.
Right, so what Dwarf, Nevins and Reisner are saying is they can't, and they're all straight, they can't walk away from someone who's gay who says to them, I can't handle monasticism, a gay Jew. You know, and that I feel it to be humiliating, and I feel it to be degrading, and I feel I have nowhere to go, which is something that I have heard gay people express. And were it to be heterosexual intimacy that was prohibited, I would which is the closest I can kind of personally empathise with it. I'd be pretty stuck as well. So that's where these three poskim are at. Let's keep going.
True, liability for humiliation is generally limited in halacha to cases where it is intentional. Yet, given the social ferment surrounding gay rights in recent years, it is difficult to dismiss accusations of intentional indifference that apply to homosexuals by many religious leaders.
Right, we can't imagine that rabbis don't know that these people exist.
Of course they do.
Right.
This fella is a man of human dignity.
Okay, that's a big step.
Yes. And as such, he got the principle stated dramatically and repeatedly in the Talmud. So great is human dignity that it supersedes the name of humanity.
Okay, good. Okay, this is so what we've just stumbled upon is the crack through which a coach and horses is about to be driven. Right? I mean, we are in the world of Denning jurisprudence, and the crack that is available is a crack that says Gadol kavod habriot, kavod, as in you should honor your father and mother, right? Dignity, right? Kavod habriot, the dignity of bria, bereshit bara, right? The great is sorry, why did I say that? Briot, right? Okay, you know, dignity to creation, understood here as human dignity, that it supersedes a lo ta'aseh, a mitzvah. Sorry, I should have looked up the Hebrew again. This is not new material that I prepared for today. I'm sorry, I'm looked up the Hebrew. A lo ta'aseh, a thou shalt not. Okay, so let's.
This is the Talmud, not Torah. The Dwarf.
Yeah, right, exactly. What? So what? Let's go on a little journey and look at what the Talmud is doing with this phrase, greatest human dignity that it supersedes a lot of the Torah. Right? Let's work out what the Talmud thinks. We'll then look at a 20th century legal responsum from within the very heart of Orthodoxy on the same issue, and then we'll go back to see what happens with this in this Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner, Shuva. It's in Brachot. Greatest human dignity since it overrides a negative precept of the Torah. Why should it? Let us apply the rule. There is no wisdom, nor understanding, nor counsel against the Lord. Right? It's a perfectly good question. What do you mean human dignity supersedes the Torah? The Torah says what the Torah says. None of your wisdom or understanding matters two piffs of a fiddle.
Good.
Right? The Torah says, don't do it. Don't do it. Rav Ben Sheva explained it for Rav Kahana to refer to only negative derabanan precepts. And they laughed at him. And he says, no. He says, this issue of Kavod HaBriot, it won't countermand what the Torah itself says as a Torah verse, but it can countermand what the rabbis added as a derabanan prohibition outside of the D'oraita biblical verse. So now you can see why Dwarf, Nevins, and Reisner spend a bit of time sort of distinguishing between what is undeniably D'oraita, anal intercourse between men, and other forms of same-sex sexual intimacy, which they believe is D'Rabbanan following Nachmanides, but contrary to Rambam, to Maimonides. So they've laughed at Rav Sheva, and Rav Kahana says, if a great man makes a statement, don't laugh at him. Where the question of human dignity is concerned, the rabbis permit it. In other words, what the rabbis are prepared to do is they are prepared to admit that they were wrong if what they said in the name of the Torah is now subsequently revealed to be an affront to the dignity of humanity. They say, we allow ourselves to be proved wrong. And it's not the only place in the rabbinic world where the rabbis allow for their own overturning. By the way, the best book to read if you want to know all the places where the rabbis allowed the halacha and even biblical verses to be overturned is a book written by, would you believe it? Any guesses? It's in Louis. Actually, I'm not sure who collected them. I mean, the real book is by Joel Roth, who collected all the examples of how these things could be overturned. That was actually his PhD dissertation, published as, I think it's called the Halachic System. And to his sadness, that's exactly what everybody uses. They kind of cry on coaches and horses, which everybody thinks is the halacha. But he's actually the only.
Do they all have to do with human dignity superseding?
No, there are a number of different issues. Okay. Keeping on going in Talmud Brachot, we're now going to get the Talmudic example. They've buried a body and are returning. Okay. The they here are Kohanim. Mm-hmm. Tell me about.
Yeah.
Trust me, they're Kohanim. They've stayed on the path, right? You'll see what's going on. Well, you see the Kohen has gone along and has walked along the path, right? Let's assume that, right? And they're just stepping back a second. The Kohen can't be in a delineated area where there is a body buried underneath, right? The Kohen can walk along the path and they can stand in the next door room, but you can't be in the same ground, within the pathway. Fine, right? So they've buried a body, and they're walking back, and there are two ways open to them. Sorry, this is a Kohen and a non-Kohen. Sorry, let me get this right. Let me make it even more. Sorry, I'm going to do even more explicit. What does the word levaya literally mean, as in levoya? Literally mean, not funeral. Escort, right? So so really what a funeral is all about is escorting the mourner, or the body, or both, or whatever. Anyhow, they've buried the body, and let's suppose that it's Patriarch Mr. Cohen, and son of Patriarch Mr. Cohen. Sorry, Patriarch Mr. Gordon, Patriarch Schwartz, right? Mr. Schwartz, and Mr. Schwartz's friend, Mr. Cohen, has gone to provide a levaya for Mr. Schwartz as he comes back from having buried his father, right? Mm-hmm. And the Cohen is going, and you know what's going on in the Cohen's mind as he's trying to do this levaya, trying to do this escort. He's like, I can't walk where the body is. I'm like, let's even just walk here. Let's even just walk here, right? That's the scenario. Mm-hmm. Sorry, you've got it right now. So there are two ways open to it. One is pure, and the other is impure. Right? By which I mean, one of which you know there are no bodies buried, and the other one of which there are bodies buried. If he goes by the pure way, if Mr. Schwartz goes by the pure way, Mr. Cohen can walk with him. If he goes with the impure way, Mr. Cohen can go with Mr. Schwartz. What? Let us say dignity? Really? Hang on. Rav Abba says this is only regarding a field where there is doubt about whether it's impure, for this is declared impure only by the rabbis. Stepping back. Mr. Cohen can't walk back to be nice to Mr. Schwartz through a field in which there are dead bodies, because it is an Isur D'Oraita, and you can't do it. Even if the dignity of Mr. Schwartz is affected by Mr. Cohen saying, I'm sorry, I can't walk with you at this point. Yes, even so. But if you don't know about this area, and it has been deemed by the rabbis as a field in which Kohanim should not go because there might be bodies in there, there is a Dwarf prohibition about going through that land, and you can go through that land if human dignity would be impacted if you didn't. You with me? I think it's quite brilliant in Judaism. I'm very, very happy to see those kinds of things playing around in Judaism. So great is human dignity that it supersedes a negative commandment of the Torah. And why? What about the verse? Neither wisdom, comprehension, or counsel can be vouchsafed against God. Rav Bar Sheba, so that's the guy that we met at the top, interpreted the verse from Proverbs before Rav Kahana as applying only to the negative commandment, do not stray. His colleagues laughed at him, saying do not stray is a biblical verse. And then he goes back to okay. Sorry, we didn't need to do that. I'll cut that out. What have we got? Human dignity allows you to go against a D'Rabbanan, but not a D'Oraita. if it's a lot assay, if it's a thou shalt not. So now let's come through to the 20th century and to see, I mean, the problem with this whole issue of human dignity is you could almost do anything with it, right? I mean, you can imagine the kinds of things that could be made permissible with human dignity. So in history, it has not been used very frequently. But it was used by the Tzitz Eliezer in the 20th century. Tzitz Eliezer is the greatest authority on matters of bioethics in 20th century Jewish life. Brackets, possibly one other person, possibly Moshe Feinstein, but Moshe Feinstein was the greatest authority on everything. Yavadi Yosef also, but the Tzitz Eliezer was, wrote the books on medical ethics, and he's being asked the question: can someone who is deaf wear a hearing aid on Shabbos? Okay. Now, let me put out of your mind turning the electrical thing on or off, because we're not going to see that. His question is going to be: can he carry the hearing aids in Rishut HaRabbanim, right? In the street, because you're not allowed to carry in the streets. So this is the problem that the Tzitz Eliezer is going to face when asked about a deaf person.
Why would you be doing that?
It's the way.
Right.
But you're still carrying it.
Right. But let's just look at where he goes, because for some reason he's decided to go here rather than to go there. But I can't. You know what? I mean, I acknowledge the validity of the question. It's not the first time. Baruch Shekavanti L'Dat Gedolim. I am blessed that I have been directed to the same concern that George you have. But let's just feel a contemporary there is no more orthodox place to go than the Tzitz Eliezer. I mean, he's an interesting guy. There's an amazing book written about him. But here we go. It's difficult to imagine the magnitude of embarrassment and unpleasantness caused to a person of restricted hearing when he comes among people in the synagogue and he is isolated, unable to hear what is going on, unable to respond to those who ask him a question. This produces a concern about kavod habriot. Very interesting. To which must be added this person's distress at foregoing public worship and being unable to hear the Torah reading and the responses to Kaddish and Kedusha, etc. Right? Everybody else is, Kaddish. The guy, he doesn't know what's going on. I mean, he can't. Well, that's the thing. He can't even talk to his neighbour. And hang on, what does he say? Yeah, the real problem is he can't talk to his neighbour. To which must be added the problem of not knowing how to respond to the Kedusha.
It's safety as well. On going to synagogue.
You can't hear the cars and everything else. Okay, here we go. This negates the performance of a batch of mitzvot of lesser and greater importance, and therefore it is preferable to permit the carrying of forbidden items on Shabbat in order to respect kavod habriot, and therefore permit the deaf person to carry his hearing aid on Shabbat. I think you can't wear mukta. Sorry, I'm realising, Joe, I now know the answer to your question. You can't wear an electrical device that you're tempted to operate. People do about digital watches. Very interesting.
In some a watch, you clearly are carrying out with instruction on your head. But a hearing aid is something that's no good to carry. You wouldn't dream of carrying a hearing aid. It's no good to
if it's plugged into your ear and you're actually operating. Okay. So what he's suggesting, right? What he's suggesting is that this is a d'Rabbanan prohibition, and that since it's a d'Rabbanan prohibition, it is capable of being overridden by this thing about human dignity.
But isn't there also kind of a value judgment of form on what is so important that is in place to human dignity? So, this great rabbi thinks not being able to be a part of hearing the Torah is such an offense to the dignity that you have to override it. He probably would think having to live celibate the rest of your life was not such an affront.
Correct. And actually, one of the things that doesn't happen in the Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner responsa, and you can probably work out where it's going, right? You know, at this point, one of the things is that they don't apologise to the memory of the Sitz Eliezer for making him spin in his grave. Which he clearly, you know, is doing, you know. Yes, but the idea that someone would take what he would perceive to be this deeply compassionate and very brave step to the very edge of acceptability and use that to permit something which he, I don't know much about his attitude towards homosexuality. Like he would never, you know, I mean, you know, it's not an orthodox position. Yeah. But, you know, Dwarf, Nevins, and Reisner cite the Sitz Eliezer and then say this, right? And actually, in some ways, your question is absolutely right. That for Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner, the compelling into isolation of a gay person, of a lesbian person, lives in the same place as the compelling into isolation of telling the deaf person that they can't take their hearing aid, right? So you're absolutely right that it does ask the moral, you know, what do we perceive morally aside from our strict positivism? I mean, I'm not a positivist, and I used to. I mean, Rabbi Roth is one of my most inspirational teachers, but I just used to fight with him on this, and I used just because I don't think you can be a positive. I just don't know how you can do it. You have to be made up of a moral code in order to read halacha. You know, this is one of my favourite examples. But Victor Borges was a kind of a cabaret act, and he was a pianist, and everybody assumed, you know, the story was that he was a great concert pianist, but he could only play 3 or 4 notes before kind of bursting into another joke or something or a crack. And you know, his best line is that, you know, they said to me, you know, why didn't you just play the piano straight? And he said, because if I play the piano straight, I can't reach the keys. You know, and I think that's halacha. You know, like I don't think you can just apply halacha robotically. You have to be rooted in the morality. But even still, I think, and Rabbi Roth, and within the ultra-Orthodox community, you will hear people say, despite the fact that I know that this is tremendously painful, I have to say no. But they're still applying their moral framework. I mean, it's still built on because, you know, maybe that's because you feel that everybody should be in heterosexual couplings for this reason or that reason, or, you know, because you feel that, you know, there's a morality. I mean, the other example, the non-emotional example, this one about mourning, right, where the Yom Tov comes in. There's still a moral judgment that's going into that. I mean, you know, you're not supposed. There are days on which you're not supposed to give a eulogy. You know, the Pesach Sheni, a month after Pesach, you're not supposed to give a eulogy because it was the month when you could go. It was the day when you could go to the temple and offer a paschal sacrifice if you couldn't go on the eve of Pesach itself, right? So therefore, no tachanun, and no eulogy. You know, I did a funeral on that, and I said, you know, this is Pesach Sheni. You're not supposed to give a eulogy. Let me share some words about this person. He was born into, you know, it's like. And the Orthodox guy from the Chevra Kadisha, Stanford, came up to me and said, I've never heard anybody do that before. It's like, wow. You know, I mean, it is moral even if you profess that it's not moral. This, by the way, you know, those of you who know the situation with my brother, who I love, this is one of the big arguments with my brother and I. He thinks he's doing straight halacha, and I refuse to let him claim that. Because you can't reach the keys. where are we on this? We're concerned with the dignity of gay and lesbian Jews, not only because we're sympathetic to their dilemma, but also because their humiliation is our humiliation. We wish to welcome them, but we do so in such a forbidding fashion that they're repeatedly humiliated. I kind of acknowledge, I know what that's like. It's very hard. I feel this with some of the young women at New London, right? They have a bat mitzvah, they do something wonderful, and then you say, that's it. You can't do that again. I don't know how that... I don't know what that means. I feel like I'm half and pulling and turning around and spinning myself around. Well, you know, these two issues are there is a similarity between these two issues. It's difficult to imagine. So now here is Ellen. I thought your question is just great, right? It's difficult to imagine a group of Jews whose dignity is more undermined than that of homosexuals, who have to date. Sorry, it's not they have to date. Who have until today been told to hide and suppress their sexual orientation, and whose desire to establish a long-term relationship with a beloved friend have been lightly dismissed by Jewish and general society. They have in effect been taught to walk alone, while the great majority of Jews are expected to walk in pairs and as families. In such a context, where is the dignity of homosexual Jews? Well, we'll see where this gets to. Maybe I'll just tell you where this gets to. Where Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner get to is that the D'Rabbanan piece, which they say is derech hibarim, male-to-male intimacy and female intimacy, is overridden by this issue of human dignity, but not male-to-male shalok hadarka, anal penetrative intercourse. We are aware that the continued biblical ban on anal sex may be extremely difficult for some gay men to observe, and that this ban is in some ways more challenging than the ban on menstrual intimacy for heterosexual couples for the 7 to 14 days that a married man can't be with a married woman, according to halacha. However, they're saying this response provides gay men with other options for sexual intimacy, with full acceptance in the observant Jewish community, and with a feasible path to a life of Torah observance, and this is as far as we can get.
When you get to the stage when homosexual men feel humiliated by that prohibition, and the people are they're stuck, they've gone as far as they can go, taking the last now. When the homosexuals feel as humiliated by the right prohibition as they did by the Quran, what then?
Right. Yes. I mean, there is. I promise I will return to engage.
We might be there already.
That's the point. Let me do this, and I'll come back to that. I think that society has moved so fast that any imposition on the individual decisions that anybody makes by a religious organisation is seen as patriarchal and patronising and unfair and unjust.
In fact, you're saying because you're offended by this rule, I'm afraid you don't find it possible.
Right. And it's a reform halachic discourse, which is I get to decide whatever I do, and who are you, Rabbi, to talk on the name of God that this is what, and the Masorti movement is going to struggle with that general social thing, with the general social thing as applies within queer discourse, right? Which is quite strong.
Can I say something quickly? Like I met someone in Israel last summer, who he was Orthodox. He was an Orthodox man, gay man. He said, "Well, I can be Orthodox and Jewish by not having anal sex." So in today's session language, he was adhere to the writer prohibition, but the rabbinic prohibition he would override himself. And in the group that I was with, most of the people were very much, clearly the writer is using the move on with the writer. There were some people who said, and I didn't have the answer, and I still don't have the answer, saying, well, you're still picking cherries out of the cake. You're still saying, I'm gonna, live as sweet a life as I can in my definition. Because if you are a Joel Roth person, you would still say, well, tough. Like, what are you doing? Why are you breaking the rabbinic laws? And like I didn't know. I still don't know the answers. So from maybe.
To go back to that. So that's the discussion with my brother and I, right? He who's Haredi. Because I am not choosing my halacha. I am doing the straight halachic thing. And so one of the things, and this goes back to this, what I'm claiming is the Louis point, or the Louis point that I like, right? Which is that when something is unspoken because of the complicated nature of what happens if you admit it, as a Masorti Jew, as a New London Synagogue person, you have to be prepared to deal with it. You have to be prepared to deal with it. So, this argument, does go on. I mean, there are. So I suspect that one of the people that he looks towards is a guy called Rabbi Steve Greenberg, who's sort of, was the first out gay Orthodox rabbi, and that is going on as well within Orthodoxy. They're not availing themselves of this kavod briot. They're just saying they're just not doing it, and they're sort of living with that. Little. The other thing that's kicking around is a teshuva that wasn't passed, failed to hit the threshold of being passed, where Gordon Tucker said the whole thing's immoral. And the whole thing is immoral. And you can't have Hodu Adonai Kito, praise be God for God is good, who says things that are not good. It's got to come out. And he went to another chapter in Joel Roth's book where you just take stuff right out, and we have, and that didn't get through the CJLS in 2006, and it's probably not. No one's going to go back and fight it all the way through because it's now reached a point where don't ask, don't tell is slightly different because, and I won't do the full paper with the full kind of thing with you, but in 2006, a response was passed that said a bunch of the nice things, like you can't discriminate against people, you have to treat people well. There's absolutely no reason to deny from gay people aliyot, the opportunities to be a shliach tzibor, and any of those kinds of things. And this was a big, big step for JTS, and this is happening in the halls of JTS. JTS, for up to that point, wouldn't admit people who were, the term used was avowed homosexuals. Have a discussion about what that means.
It's a very American term.
Right, into the rabbinical school, that's gone, and now JTS admits people regardless of sexuality. And the Dwarf Nevins Reisner said, we need to work on a ceremony. We need to work out a way to say to people who are gay, and this has been this is one of the things that sort of has been on my mind as I've been involved in this issue. I was very involved in this issue between 2003, 2002 and 2006. The goal is sanctified monogamy. That's what Judaism is kind of trying to say. And the possibilities, and there are gay people who can have families with kids and gays who don't, some choose to and some don't choose to, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the sort of, you want to give someone a derech, a pathway whereby that becomes possible. And that's been one of the things that's been very much on my mind. And there is now a subsequent response on looking at what that ceremony might be. Also, in the context of dissolution of such a relationship, and there's a sort of there's that kind of discussion. We'll look at that next week. That's the guts of what I wanted to do with you today. It's not a blanket permission. I wanted to set the prohibition within the context of the different levels of prohibitions within different kind of contexts, and also just say that I kind of get this personally. I believe that this is something you can say to someone who's gay. Certainly something you can say to someone who's lesbian, because there's no notoriety that's there at all. It's harder to say it to gay people, and I just hide behind what I do generally, which is I don't generally walk around telling people to do whatever they want to do. I'm much more interested in responsibilities. I'm less interested in human rights and more interested in chiyuv, obligations. I'm just wired that way. So some of the sort of liberationist discourse I can't handle it rabbinically, even on things like the right to say whatever you want to freedom of speech. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in lashon hara, the prohibition against evil language. I just come at this from a Jewish place rather than from this sort of rights discourse, and that's going to, around an issue like anal intercourse, there will be a butting up. There will be I've done really well. Come on. there will be a point of non-meeting at that point. Yeah.
Someone's supposed to do something very wrong. Obviously, if you're in a relationship with somebody, you wouldn't have thought, would you?
Yeah, but actually, I think I hear that, and I'm not going to start checking on behaviour. That's the point that Joel was making.
You don't check on
but I do say to people who are straight, you can't have sex 28 days a month.
But at least that's something they don't even miss part of the month. They're not missing that.
I agree, and I'm not making the claim. And neither of them is Reisner. I mean, it's nothing for a period of time, but then for everything. But by the way, not anal intercourse with one's wife, prohibited. No.
Well, there was one I talked about something like people had it sort of explained, so it's committed. As long as it's consensual.
Right, that doesn't. You know what? Like that kind of language just doesn't sound to me like halacha. Anytime yeah. So let me just do one. Let me just do one last point. This is high-grade plutonium in a community. It is complicated. It's difficult. It's interesting to me who's here tonight and who's not here tonight. Partly because I haven't made as big a deal about teaching this as I could have done, because it's high-grade plutonium. So I'm going to end with two things. This is the first one. Once in a tropical country, a certain splendid bird, more colourful than any that had ever been seen, was sighted at the top of the tallest tree. But the bird was perched so high that no single person could ever hope to reach it. When news of the bird reached the ears of the king, he ordered that a number of his subjects try and bring the bird to him, and they were to stand on one another's shoulders until they could reach the bird and bring it to the king. The king's subjects assembled near the tree, but while they were standing balanced on one another's shoulders, some of those near the bottom decided to wander off. And as soon as the first person moved, the entire chain collapsed, injuring several of them. The bird flew off, and as for the people, they had doubly felled the king. For even greater than his desire to see the bird was his desire to see his people work so closely joined together. It's just not permitted to walk away. As hard as you feel on the one thing, on the other thing, and as difficult, you can't walk away. That's one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I want to say is this. I talked about the number of people around the 25-person CJLS table who voted for the Dwarf, for the Joel Roth homosexual paper. It's on page 2. So of the 25 people, 13 voted in favour, 8 voted against, and 4 abstained. Now the Dwarf's, Nevins, Reisner tshuva, 13 voted in favour, and 12 voted against. From which you know, by the way, they voted at the same meeting, that one person voted both in favour of Roth and in favour of Roth. Despite the fact that Roth and Reisner disagree on Absolutely everything. So I rang him up. And Rabbi Adam Quickfell said that he voted for both, partly because he wanted both to have a clear majority. He thought that the idea of having papers that were passed by a minority was wrong. And partly because he felt that he could agree that both were acceptable halachic visions, despite the fact that whether or not he felt he wanted one or he wanted the other. They were both capable of being halachic. Now, he doesn't have, it's not emotional to him in the same way as it is to someone who's gay, but I acknowledge that and I applaud that. Right. Because it turns out that Eilu Ba'Eilu on an issue like this, right, this is the, both these and these are the words of the living God. It's not about difficult arguments where one is right and you don't know which one it is, but the ability to acknowledge both one side of an argument and the other side of the argument, of having enough validity to support them both. Now that's a no. By the way, so you know where this conversation goes. Hillel and Shammai disagreed about absolutely everything. You follow Hillel, why? Because he's nice, and he listens to everybody, and even he lets Shammai go first. I'm not suggesting that Roth is Shammai and Hillel is Dwarf, Nevins, Reisner, but I've tried to listen really hard, and I certainly let Roth go first. Thank you all very much, and we'll have another go next week.
Great.